Hello and welcome back. It is Monday. I am Mr. Sisotris, and this week I wanted to go through a list I found online of the 10 greatest sci-fi authors ever. The list was created by Discover Sci-Fi, and it was the result of user votes. I think the list is from 2019, so it's older-ish, but it's a good starting point. So I figured I'd go through the list, see which of these authors I've read, what I thought of them, and then I've got a couple honorable mentions that will kind of add to the list at the end. So we're just going to jump right into it. The first few on this list are ones that I haven't read, so we'll go through those a little faster. So let's do this. So first on the list, this is number 10, and the author's name is Frederik Pohl, best known for a book called The Space Merchants, which came out in 1952. I have not read this one. I haven't even heard of this one before, so I definitely want to check it out. 1950s, 1960s sci-fi is a great era, lots of innovation, and it was kind of interesting to see kind of a sci-fi world in the future that wasn't informed by like the digital age. This is kind of back when everything was analog. So I have not read this one. Frederik Pohl, never heard of him. Definitely going to check him out after this. Next up is Larry Niven, number 9, and he's best known for Ringworld. The first book came out in 1970. This is terrible. I have not read any Larry Niven. I have heard of him, and he's on my list. I just keep not reading his stuff. That's terrible. So yes, he's on my list. I will check him out. If there's any super fans of his out there, please let me know what you love about his work, because I am excited to check it out. Next up, we've got Anne McCaffrey, her Dragon Riders of Pern series. The first book was published in 1968. I have not read any of hers. This is so terrible. From what I've heard about her, her work sort of blends fantasy and sci-fi. You've got like science fiction world, but you've got dragons as well. So I don't know, I think that might be fun. So that's definitely one that I want to check out. I have not read any of her works. For those of you who have read her works, does it hold up? Is it still accessible and fun? What did you think of it? Love to hear about it. All right, number 7, we finally get to an author that I have read, and that's Ray Bradbury, probably most well known for Fahrenheit 451, published in 1953. I really love Ray Bradbury. I've also read, on the shelf here, his Martian Chronicles, and he also wrote, a ton of stuff, but he also wrote Something Wicked This Way Comes, which I haven't read, but I do want to check out. But he has a really great, an author voice that just kind of drags you in. He's very good at talking about like social change and the importance of kind of what makes us us. And he explores both of those themes in The Martian Chronicles and Fahrenheit 451. This book is very unsettling to read because it's one of those things where a lot of what makes the world is stuff that isn't really talked about directly. The people that live in this world are sort of programmed to be distracted all the time, and so they don't notice what's going on. And so you get glimpses every now and then of like these horrible things happening in the background of, wars and conflict and destruction. But everyone is so focused on like advertisements and vapid television that they're not kind of noticing what's going on. And the loss of like reading material, the loss of literature, is sort of something that people decided on their own. Now, this isn't really a book about censorship, but it is about sort of control and keeping people ignorant. But it's really scary how it's set up, how like the society changed things in like to the point where people themselves decided that literature wasn't worth reading. They sort of moved away from it on their own because they were told that, there's just nothing of value in there. But such a fantastic book, and even though it was written in the 50s, it feels prescient and it feels modern. I think he has like male and female characters that show up, and they both have equal depth, which is something you don't often see in kind of the 50s. but he was a fantastic writer and was really, really one that we should keep reading for sure. So Ray Bradbury, number 7, definitely deserves to be on this list. All right, number 6 is H.G. Wells, best known for The War of the Worlds. This was published in 1898. This is one of my favorite books of all time ever. It is so good. It's creepy, it's unsettling, it's scary, but it also makes you think in deep ways. This is sort of the quintessential alien invasion story. It inspired everything after it, and the aliens, like, they harvest people and they drink their blood and they poison people with this black smoke, and it's very kind of apocalyptic. So much of the book involves the main character, who's just a normal guy, sort of walking through destroyed streets and seeing sort of what's happening. A lot of the action is happening kind of in the distance or off screen. There's a few times when he comes face to face with one of the aliens or something, and it's very tense, but it's very much a sense of, like, what would an alien invasion story be like from the ground level, from a normal person. You know, most of them focus on, like, the president or, you know, the military folks or the people who are actively engaged with fighting off the aliens. And in this one, it's just a normal everyday guy wandering around trying to figure out what's happening, and he slowly pieces together what's been going on. This book is fantastic. H.G. Wells is amazing. I've also read The Time Machine and The Invisible Man. He's such an imagination, and I love him so much. So yes, he definitely deserves to be on this list. All right, number 5 on the list is Frank Herbert. Everyone knows who Frank Herbert is at this point, best known for Dune. And he is a really terrific writer. He has this kind of esoteric vibe that is just really compelling. His future is one in which sort of computers have been outlawed because of you know, the Butlerian Jihad, which took place in the past. And so you've got this kind of, it almost feels like a fantasy world where you've got palaces and monarchy and court intrigue, and there is some technology, but it's all like spaceships and tools and stuff. It's not a digital world. It's very Baroque in a way. And I really love his writing style. He does get very strange in the later books in the Dune series, but it's a ton of fun. There is a couple things in the books that have not aged very well. Frank Herbert was not super progressive in how he viewed queer people, and there's a few stereotypes that pop up through here. But, you know, I think he's still worth reading. He's really engaging, and he has a lot to say about sort of human nature and how we deal with change and revolution and growth and the lures of power and how power can corrupt, because this is not a savior who comes in and saves Dune. This is very much someone who gets pulled into a very complex manipulation that's been set up, centuries in advance, and is kind of finds himself playing to a part that was created for him by others who are sort of manipulating the whole thing. And the whole series, it just gets weirder and weirder, and I love it so much. It's great, and you should definitely read it if you haven't. The first book is quite big, but honestly the other ones aren't, and it's a ton of fun, and you should keep reading them, because please do. Frank Herbert is fantastic. All right, number 4 on this list is Philip K. Dick. He's probably most well known for the story Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which was 1968. I have a collection of his works, and he is another one who's he feels like endlessly relevant. I think he's one of those more classic sci-fi authors that you can read now, and it doesn't feel like there's a disconnect in terms of the age or the years in between kind of when he was writing it and when you're reading it. Really accessible, and a lot of the stuff that he has to say still feels relevant to today. One short story of his that I really like is We Can Remember It For You Wholesale, which is the story which inspired Total Recall. And the movie is really good. It sort of expands the story out and makes it a little more twisty-turny. but the story is based on sort of just the central premise of like, is this a memory or is it real? What do you think? He really makes you think. He really like tackles high concept ideas, and definitely a reader that more people should check out. He also did The Man in the High Castle, which was turned into a TV show. I haven't seen the TV show, but his writing is fantastic, and we should keep reading his work. All right, number 3 on this list is Arthur C. Clarke, which is one of my sci-fi favorites. I love him so much. He's probably most well known for 2001: A Space Odyssey, which came out in 1968. This is sometimes called a novelization of the film, but in actuality it was written at the same time as the film, and there's a few differences between the film and this, most namely where they go in the third kind of big section. In the book they go to one of the moons of Saturn, but in the movie they didn't think that they could pull that off with the technology of the time, and so they changed it to Jupiter, because that was a little easier to portray on screen, because you didn't have to deal with the rings. And so the sequels to this, there's 3 sequels, and they all assume that kind of the events of the film are canon, and so they don't really follow what happened here. So, you know, the 3 books are very much, they're sequels to this, but they're also sequels to the film. It's a little complicated, but Arthur C. Clarke is amazing. He's also really amazing at short fiction. I have a whole huge massive collection of his short works, and he's just a terrific writer. He's another one of those that's aged really well, and again, he's writing about kind of an analog world, so when he has things like computers that become massive and can achieve consciousness, they're always still analog computers. But he's a really terrific writer and really good at sort of high concept strangeness. Again, I don't know if he's considered hard sci-fi, but he was very focused on realism, making sure that things made sense, kind of internal logic to technology. And so even when he's kind of explaining how things work, it doesn't feel dry. He's really engaging, and I definitely love his stuff. He also wrote Rendezvous with Rama, which is one that I have not read yet, but I want to. He also wrote Childhood's End, which I do want to check out. I do have that one, but I haven't read it yet. So Arthur C. Clarke, definitely one of the greats, deserves to be on this list. Number 2 on the list is Robert A. Heinlein. He's probably most well known for Starship Troopers, which came out in 1959. He also wrote Stranger in a Strange Land, which came out in the 60s. I don't know the exact year for that one. And Heinlein's really interesting because he's one who, he definitely had the big concepts. He was very much interested in kind of social change and social critique. He kind of comes at it more from sort of a libertarian perspective, but he's really influential, and he was also one that was really focused on making sure things were realistic and had that internal logic. So it's moving away from kind of hand-wavy, like, it just happens because we've got the XYZ device and that's okay. But I think Heinlein's one that his stuff, it might be difficult for newer viewers to get into, especially Stranger in a Strange Land. That one was very groundbreaking for its time, in the way that it sort of portrayed sort of free love, and it came up with the term to grok, which means to kind of understand something profoundly. And so he is very important, and we should keep talking about him. But the way that he portrays women in Stranger in a Strange Land is not great. They're all sort of infantilized, and they're sort of treated as like they have to be like the housekeepers, and they're not, I don't know, just the characters are very mean to them. And he could have just been sort of encouraging people to focus on the way women are treated so as to encourage them to move beyond that. That's definitely an interpretation, but it can be difficult to read because so many sci-fi authors are very progressive, and they kind of move beyond what society sort of thinks. I think he tried, but didn't quite do it in a way that would continue to keep him relevant. So I think we should still read his stuff, because it was very influential, and it's good to see how he influenced other sci-fi writers who came after him. But just be aware of kind of the attitudes of the day. There were other authors around that same time who wrote really fantastic female characters. Actually, Frank Herbert was writing in the 60s, and he has tons of really amazing, strong, women characters in his books. And despite some of the other failings, he wrote women very well. Arthur C. Clarke does very well too. So I don't know. You can say, he's a product of his time, but there were other authors writing at the same time as Heinlein who understood how to write women with nuance. So, that might just be a blind spot of his, but we shouldn't cancel his work or just stop reading it completely. It's definitely something we need to kind of keep a hold of, but just kind of be aware of how the author's attitudes affected his writing. All right, and then number 1 on this list was Isaac Asimov. He is an undoubted master of the craft, so influential. He was very prolific. He wrote tons of short stories and a number of really important book series. Probably most known because of the recent TV show is Foundation. The first book came out in 1951. He also did a series of, oh my goodness, there were a series of like the robot mysteries. I don't know what they're called. That's terrible. So awful. Anyways, but Isaac Asimov is fantastic. He's one of my favorites. Really interesting, really high concept, crazy stuff. The Foundation series is massive. Each book is pretty small, but they cover such a vast swath of time that it's just, and he kind of kept adding to it over time. There's now prequels, and there's 2 prequels to the series, and then a number of sequels. This is just kind of the initial trilogy, but there's more kind of added to it. And Asimov is wonderful. His short stories especially are excellent, especially his robot stories. I really, really love those. Now, Asimov, one of his blind spots was writing women as well. In Foundation, especially the first book, he kind of compensates for this by just not including any, women characters at all. I think there's like one who appears on a phone call in one scene, and then there's maybe another one who's like in the background but doesn't have any lines. So, not great, but he did kind of grow and change and evolve over time. One kind of famous thing is that people kind of criticized him for not including a lot of sex in his books, because a lot of other authors, especially later in his career, other authors were getting more daring and more bold and everything, and he just liked the technical stuff. He liked technical problems, and so eventually he said, fine, if you're all going to make fun of me for this, I'm going to write this book, The Gods Themselves, and this book is like all about sex. It's like, it's important, like it's a complicated sci-fi problem of, taking energy from another universe and how that energy affects the other universe. But this book is just, it's bonkers. Like in the 3rd section, you've got people who live on like a moon base, and since there's no gravity, they're like, well, since there's no gravity, we don't have to worry about friction, so just everyone's naked on the moon. And so it's a little bonkers, but it's still a great book. But it's definitely one where he was like, fine, and just wanted to make a point to everyone who was making fun of him for writing kind of sterile books. But Asimov is wonderful. He's a really talented writer, and he was really good at creating like sci-fi problems that you would kind of watch the characters work through and break it down and figure out how to solve it. And I think Asimov is really, really influential in Star Trek, because you see that a lot in especially the original series and Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, where you'll have like a complicated problem that comes up and everyone has to kind of work together and logic their way out of the problem to solve it and figure out how to escape. And a lot of the episodes of the early Star Trek stuff is based around that. Not so much in the movies, but in like the TV show. And that owes a lot to Asimov, because his robot novels especially, it's very much like, okay, we've got these 3 laws of robotics and something is wrong with one of them. Because the whole thing about the 3 laws of robotics is that they don't work. And so a lot of his stories were all about the problems that could come from being very complacent and assuming that the 3 laws were kind of inviolable kind of thing. And so he would have stories where something was wrong, where a robot was technically following all 3 laws, but it was causing a problem and they had to find a way to logic their way out of it. And it's really satisfying. Asimov is great, and we should definitely keep reading his work because I love him so much. Now, on this list, there were a couple authors that I was kind of surprised didn't show up on the list. It was, I mean, there was lots of classic authors, but it was also just, there was a couple really influential sci-fi authors who didn't show up. Now, obviously, this was voted on by viewers, so obviously these people might have been in the list, but just never made the top 10. And so I wanted to throw in a couple of my like honorable mentions that need to be addressed. One is Mary Shelley. Frankenstein is very much considered sort of the first sci-fi novel. It was published in 1818. I know it feels like it's a horror story, and it is, but it's not fantasy horror the way like Dracula would be, where the antagonist is a supernatural creature kind of imbued by sort of satanic powers. In Frankenstein, the creature is brought to life through scientific means. He's reanimated through kind of a scientific process, and then the scientist character, Frankenstein, has to sort of contend with the ethics of what comes from creating a life and then abandoning it, and what that results in. And that's very much sci-fi. It's sort of dealing with the ethics of decisions and the ethics of what you want to do. And Frankenstein inspired so many other science fiction authors. You see this kind of theme in like H.G. Wells' The Island of Dr. Moreau. You see it in Jurassic Park by Michael Crichton. You see it in Oryx and Crake by Margaret Atwood. It's, you know, kind of the hubris of science going too far and dealing with the results. So definitely Mary Shelley deserves to be on the list. Now, she's not known for being a prolific sci-fi writer. This is kind of a rare occurrence, but we do need to talk about her because she sort of invented the genre. Another one that needs to be mentioned is Jules Verne. You probably have heard of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. That one is 1869. I love Jules Verne so much. He was a favorite as a kid, and he's still very accessible and readable. And again, very concerned with like internal logic, and you know, his 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea is really notable because it conceived of like an electric submarine, and at the time electricity was like, it was like unheard of for mass production. Like, you know, you had scientists creating like small sparks in labs and kind of things, so like they knew of it, but the concept of like an electric power plant that could power an entire submarine was just insane to the people at that time. In the movie version that Disney did in the 50s, they again did like nuclear power, you know, talking about, you know, what if it was a nuclear powered sub, to kind of make it keep up with the times. But, you know, initially, you know, the Nautilus is an electric sub, and that was a big deal in the 1860s. So Jules Verne, love his work. He's a lot of fun. Another one we need to talk about is Ursula K. Le Guin. Very influential, very important. Her book, The Left Hand of Darkness, that one came out in 1969. And this one dealt with sort of gender and class issues and social issues. And this is part of kind of a series of a bunch of other books that are technically sort of planetary romance, where you've got sort of someone arrives on a planet and the problem all takes place on the planet, and at the end they kind of leave and move on. But Ursula K. Le Guin is such a master, and she was very forward thinking. She wrote all of her characters with really great depth, very progressive, and for writing in the 60s, you know, alongside folks like, you know, Heinlein and Herbert, her stuff feels very modern. The pacing can be a little slow for some people because it's not as actiony and explosion-y, but it's deep and it makes you think, and it's very compelling. So we definitely need to keep reading Ursula K. Le Guin. Her fantasy stuff, like the Earthsea series, even though it's kind of aimed at a younger audience, it's still really worth reading as adults. So we need to not forget about her. She's good. Next up, I know I just did a video on this, but I want to mention Douglas Adams, most known for Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which came out in 1979. Douglas Adams is comedic, and so a lot of people don't really include him on like greatest sci-fi author lists ever, but he's great. And if you want to see me rant about Hitchhikers and all what makes that series amazing, you can check out the link above. But moving on, the next one I wanted to talk about is William Gibson. This is one that I haven't actually read any of his work, but I did want to include him on this list because I think he is incredibly influential. He is sort of the granddaddy of sort of the cyberpunk genre. His book Neuromancer came out in 1984 and was really influential to a lot of things. Like William Gibson's influence is all over things like The Matrix. And so, but I think he deserves to be on this list. He's an author that I've wanted to read for a long time. I don't have any of his books, but I'm always on the lookout for them. But I think cyberpunk is really an important genre because it's been really influential, but it's not talked about as much in kind of the mainstream. And so I can see why maybe he wasn't included on this list. But I definitely think we need to not let him fade away, and we need to keep reading his stuff. Next up in my honorable mentions, I wanted to talk about Dan Simmons, best known for Hyperion. This one came out in 1989. And I think, Dan Simmons is one of my favorite authors because I think this series is so important, and it's one of my favorite sci-fi series ever. But it feels like this is sort of a culmination of sort of every sci-fi genre that came before it, and it also has connections to like classic literature, and it's just a huge sweeping story that involves different genres and big, huge concepts. It's got time travel and destiny, and it's very much kind of like the quintessential sci-fi series. And I think it's definitely one that people need to check out. Another on my honorable mentions list is a personal favorite of mine, and I'm shocked whenever she doesn't make it to like greatest sci-fi lists ever, and that is Octavia Butler. She's probably most well known for Parable of the Sower, which came out in 1993, but she was writing long before that. She did Kindred in the 70s, and she's also got Dawn, her Lilith Brood trilogy, and she's also done some horror stuff as well. But Octavia Butler is just incredible. This is an author where you read her work today, and it feels like it was written last week. Like, it feels so valid and relevant and important, and she deals with social issues that people in her time weren't super concerned about. This one here is a post-apocalyptic story of, not really post-apocalyptic, it's more like dystopian, we'll say that, because it's kind of in the midst of collapsing. But it's just the things that she discusses, the concepts and the social issues are still super relevant today. And Octavia Butler is such a terrific writer, and her stuff just feels modern and slick. It feels like she's just a contemporary of like N.K. Jemisin. It's like they've both been writing at the same time, just putting out books. But unfortunately, Octavia Butler is no longer with us, which is terrible because she was such an outstanding talent, and we definitely need to keep reading her books. Her Lilith Brood series, starting with Dawn, is incredible. This is much more sci-fi, aliens, weird transhumanism themes and gender and stuff, and this one's much more about sort of gender and social issues and race and all that kind of stuff. So definitely Octavia Butler, we need to not forget her because she's incredible. And then finally on this list of honorable mentions, this is an author that I think deserves to be on the list of greatest evers, but because he's fairly new on the scene, relative speaking, to like, Jules Verne and them, people don't often think about him, and that is, and I'm going to try to pronounce this right, but it's Cixin Liu, and that is, he's the author of The Three-Body Problem. I'm reading the third book in the series right now, and I'm almost done, so next week I'll be doing a review of the whole series. His work is so incredible. This has the feel of like Isaac Asimov and Arthur C. Clarke and Octavia Butler, just these huge, massive, high concept things that break your brain apart and ask huge questions about society, what it means to be human, things like economics and scientific discovery. Like, it's a massive thing, and you're kind of in awe at how he's able to fit all of that into these books, because it's just one trilogy of books, but it feels like I've been reading this like long 12 book series that just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And there's tons of really incredible sci-fi stuff. So he definitely deserves to be on this list. More people need to read his stuff. It can kind of break your brain at times, so you just have to kind of let it go. But I promise it will all make sense. But Cixin Liu, we definitely need to keep reading his work, and I want to get more. Every time he writes something new, I want it to be translated so we can keep reading it, because he's a really terrific writer, and I think he's definitely up there with the greats. All right, so with that said, I'm going to let you go. Obviously, there's more authors that could be on the list. There's tons of sci-fi authors that I was looking at my own shelves and being like, well, I could include them too. But it was more like I like them because I personally like them. Now, with everything, it's really difficult to say like this is an objectively good author kind of thing, because everything is about personal preference. So if you disagree with anything on this list, that's totally fine. The initial list of 10 authors, I was reading them and I was like, okay, this isn't like my personal favorites, but I can see why they put this list together. So, personal taste is individual to everyone, and that's fine. But it's really, I really hope to see the kind of the like top 10 lists start to shift, because there's a lot of really incredible authors in the last 30 years who really deserve to be on that list as well. So with that said, I will let you go. I will see you next week, and in the meantime, happy reading. Bye.